Thank you all for coming, especially on such a cold and wet night, to the Mill Road History Society. And thank you to them for inviting me to talk as part of Open Cambridge this evening. Open Cambridge is a celebration of our local community, heritage and history, and it is a pleasure to be here telling you a little bit more about a local man from a Cambridge family, Mr. Frederick Leach. The plan for this evening's talk is to introduce you to Mr. Leach, although I can see some of you will not need an introduction. I'm going to set him in context as a Cambridge man, and in the spirit of Open Cambridge, along the way point out some places locally where you can see more of his work and learn more about him. And as the theme of this year's Open Cambridge is roots, networks and connections, I shall also be looking at how the success of the Leach firm was dependent on a series of personal, logistical and ideological connections and networks which stretched out right across the country. Also, I should say, in the spirit of Open Cambridge, I'm sharing ongoing research or work in progress. So some of this you will be seeing in the raw, as it were. But by the end, I hope you will have learned more about Leach's life and work, and more importantly, be keen to discover more, and indeed possibly even help me reveal more as we go. So here he is, Frederick Richard Leach. He was a true Victorian, born in Cambridge in 1837, just a few months before Victoria came to the throne. He died in Cambridge, aged 67, in 1904. He grew up in a house on Maid's Causeway over near Midsummer Common, and he lived at his workshops with his extended family in City Road, just off Fitzroy Street. He then moved to a large house on the then new De Freville estate and was buried at St Andrew's Church in Chesterton. Now, I've spent significant parts of the past 15 years researching his life, his family, and the work of the firm of Artworkman that he established in Cambridge in 1862. But I first encountered the work of Mr. Leach way back in the 1980s, when I travelled up from Brighton to work out which college I should put on my UCA entry form. I applied here, and almost entirely for this reason. This is Queen's College Old Hall, designed by George Frederick Bodley. And during my time at Queen's, I discovered a little bit more about my favourite room, including that this stunning hand-painted wall and ceiling decoration was originally carried out by the Leach firm in 1875. So scroll forward now 25 years to 2010, and a conversation with my very dear friend Tamsin Wimhurst, who told me of her discovery of a remarkable survival, a 19th century hand-painted interior in a small terraced house off Mill Road. Here we are. She said she had interviewed the elderly woman who still lived there, who had told her that her grandfather, David Daniel Parr, seen here, had worked for Mr. Leach of City Road. I wonder if that's the same Leach who painted Queen's Old Hall, I mused out loud. And that was it. I was on board the most extraordinary 10-year project to conserve and open to the public what is now known as David Parr House. This is the front room. And if you haven't already been, I urge you to go to the website and book a tour. If you have been, but not for a while, I urge you to go again, as you will have a different but equally fabulous experience thanks to the wonderful house guides. Next month, I should say, there will be a very exciting opportunity at David Parr House to visit the rooms of the house in a less structured way than a tour, because they're having an exhibition called House Guests. So look out for that. But all of this is just to explain that the initial motivation for researching the working life of Frederick Leach was to provide a context for better understanding and appreciating the work of David Parr, who did this. We hoped that the work of the Leach firm would give us a frame for and a bridge to link the painted walls in the humble Gwyder Street home to some of the grandest surviving 19th century painted interiors in Cambridge and all over the country. But we hadn't quite bargained for the two things that happened next. Firstly, we met Rick Leach, one of Frederick Leach's great-grandsons, who is the keeper of a very rich and well-curated Leach family archive. And secondly, we discovered that Leach's City Road workshops still existed and were about to be demolished. This is Rick on the right, just talking to local artist John Harris at the City Road site. You can see some of the buildings as they were, no longer, on the top right there. And some of these are the items that we managed to salvage from the workshops that you can see on display at the Visitor Centre and shop at the David Parr House. Now, from Rick's extensive archive, it was possible to trace the Leach family story in Cambridge right back to the 17th century. I'm not going to do that tonight, you'll be pleased to hear. There was indeed so much material that we were able to mount an exhibition called Cooks and Colours at the Museum of Cambridge a few years ago. But just to give you a little bit of background, this is Barnet Leach, our Frederick's paternal grandfather, and he was head cook at Trinity College in Cambridge, following in his father's footsteps. And this is Barnet's wife, Margaret Hopkins Leach, known as Maggie. Her brother was the head cook at Trinity Hall and King's Colleges, and his wife Sarah was famous for making and selling Cambridge brawn in Slaughterhouse Lane near Market Square. On the death of her husband, Maggie became landlady of the Pickerel Inn, still going strong on Magdalen Street. And you can see one of her advertisement cards there with M. Leach at the top. The letter you can see at the bottom was written by Maggie to her son, Richard Hopkins Leach, our Frederick's father. And the letter was written on the 30th of September, 1816. Richard had completed his apprenticeship as an artist engraver in London 2 years before and had walked to Cornwall as a journeyman artist in search of work and a patron. This was not going well. There's a whole other story to be told about Richard's Cornish adventures. It was not going well, and so his mother, Maggie, wrote to him this letter. "My dear child, your being in such a remote part of the country is the cause of much uneasiness to me. If we mutually concur in our wishes, I am of opinion that you should return to Cambridge, where some expedient may be tried for your practicing business. Why not try house painting in Cambridge?" So Richard did return. He married his long-term sweetheart, Isabella, and he set up his business. 4 years later, in 1824, a letter reached the household in Maid's Causeway, simply addressed, as you can see, Mr. R. Leach, house painter, Cambridge. I think we can assume he did set up the business successfully. And this letter, I should say, is my cue just to very briefly mention the extraordinary postal service, which of course is one of the key networks and series of connections that enabled the Leach business to operate at all. Frederick Leach's pocketbooks and diaries contain references to hundreds of letters and postcards that he wrote each year, partly to keep in contact with family members, but also to carry out his business. He would send estimates, receive patterns and designs, send out instructions to workers, arrange for supplies to be sent to jobs, paid wages, received checks, and so on, obviously all through the postal system. But by the time of his sudden death, Frederick's father, Richard, was best known in Cambridge as an inn-sign painter. A humble but clever artist, as one of the newspapers called him. And these 4 large double-sided inn signs, painted by Richard Hopkins Leach, can be seen in the Museum of Cambridge. The one on the left here is The Man Loaded with Mischief. This is the John Gilpin, the Hopvine, and the Castle. These are enormous paintings on wood, and they are double-sided with a different picture each side. They were intended to swing from a post on the road to be seen whichever direction you were travelling in. They're well worth going to have a look at. So Frederick's father's business had included the trade of house painting, but also a considerable amount of artistic work. And this is a trend that carries on down through the family. And this is the Leach family in 1849, painted in oils by Richard Hopkins Leach, who is seated on the far right there, and his wife Isabella on the left. And they had 13 children. I should say at least 13 children, 13 that I know about. And these are the only 4 surviving. And this young man in the middle, just preparing his palette, is Frederick, who we're talking about today. Frederick's father died when he was just 14, 2 years after the oil painting was made. The family archive contains one longhand journal written by Frederick in his teens, containing sketches and watercolours and painting a vivid and detailed picture of his day-to-day life in Cambridge. It's an extraordinary record, which I would love to get edited and out there. It really is a fantastic account of life in Cambridge, mid-19th century. Frederick, among other things, assiduously records the weather, extremely important for painters who were often working outdoors, obviously, but also the rain and the damp affected drying times, whether they were working outside or inside. So I particularly like this one here, Weather S-A-Y, same as yesterday, which comes up a lot. And on the first page of the journal, which he's called Reflections, as you can see, he records his earliest memory, and that is a trip to London on one of the very first trains. At the time he wrote this, age 14, I don't think he could possibly have imagined how much of his working life he would have been spent on trains, travelling the length and breadth of the country. Now, a note on the sources, as they say. As I mentioned, the Leach family archive is very rich and detailed, but one of the first things we learned from the family was that any early business records, account books, design papers, client lists, customer order books, etc., from the Leach workshops, office and showroom were likely to have been passed down through Frederick's son, Walter Perry Leach, and from him to his son, John Leach, whose office and workshop on Caroline Place were completely destroyed by fire in 1970. Single reason why, for many years, nobody'd heard of Frederick Leach. There's no central business accounts to study. There was one key exception to this, a cash book covering the first 6 years of the firm, which had been donated to the Museum of Cambridge. The main surviving source, therefore, for the work of the firm is these: Frederick Leach's own personal pocket diaries and notebooks. And these pocket books are both rich in information and incredibly hard to decipher, partly because they are the very small books he literally carried in his top pocket. The little one on the handy diary is one of those, it's even smaller than the current Cambridge pocket diary. He carried with him every day when he went about his business in Cambridge and when he travelled by train all over the country, estimating for, carrying out and supervising work. They are written in often very hastily, sometimes in pencil and then written over in ink afterwards, and they use abbreviations, understandably. They are not a deliberate record, still less an official account of the work of the firm. They include business and family and social activities all mixed up together. Typical entries might be just a name and a set of figures with no context as to whether the name is a place, a building, a person, nor whether the person might be a client, a friend, a designer, an architect, or a worker. This page in the middle looks blue. I can tell you that AET, if I can find the top of the list here, AET, that you can just see, is Alfred Edward Tombleson. HH further down is Henry Hall, CP is Charles Powell, DDP is David Daniel Parr, and MAT there is materials, which means that these are wages and additional material costs for a job. However, as you can see, nothing here tells us where or what the job was. All we know is the approximate date because of where it occurs in the chronology in the diary. This makes piecing together the activities of the firm very difficult, to put it mildly. Occasionally, Frederick chose his red ink, as you can see up on the right there, to record special or significant events and happenings. This one is about the wedding of his daughter, Ada, to Harry Heffer. As part of the Life and Art in a Worker's House project at David Parr House, I was lucky to work with a handful of dedicated volunteers to have a first go at extracting some concrete information from these pocketbooks about where Frederick might have been working and for whom. It was a painstaking task, but what we did discover gave us a framework to include in the training for the house guides at David Parr House to start to tell the wider story of David Parr and to explain his work with the firm. The distillation of that work is my little book on Frederick Leach, which is available solely through and in support of David Parr House, which is why I feel okay to plug it. I'm not benefiting personally from this. Online, you can buy it online via the website or from the shop at the Visitor Centre in Gwyder Street. So, that quick romp is introductions, context, sources, and some further reading covered. Let's look now at Frederick Leach's reputation at the time his firm was expanding and carrying out some of its most prestigious commissions in the 1880s. So we're now nearly 20 years on from when he founded the firm in 1862. And I'm going to be speaking for most of the rest of the talk about this decade, the 1880s. In 1880, Frederick Leach was 43. He had been married to Mary Ann Goodenough for 16 years. They had 7 surviving children, ranging in age from 16 down to 2, and they were living at 35 to 37 City Road, the workshops. Now, this lovely photo shows the whole family. I wanted you to be able to put faces to the names, but as you can see at the top, 92 there, this photograph is actually from 1892, so you have to imagine everyone 10 years younger at the time I'm talking about. But obviously this is Frederick and Mary Ann, and then there's Barnet, Frederick, Walter, Charles, Ethel and Edith. Oh, and Ada, sorry, and Ada. So that's the family. So the 1880s. This is a photograph of Maud Darwin with her husband George, son of Charles Darwin, and her sister Ella Dupuy. They're relaxing in the garden of George and Maud's new house, Newnham Grange, on Silver Street in Cambridge, now part of Darwin College. Seen here on the right in an illustration by Maud's daughter, Gwen Ravarat. When the newlyweds moved in, they immediately set about remodelling the house, and by the spring of 1885, when the builders had nearly finished, Maud wrote excitedly to her sister Ella. "The men are waiting for the papers and the paint to be chosen. I was in despair when a happy thought struck me. Why not have Mr. Leach? Mr. Leach is a man who has a great deal of taste, and people send all over England for him to do their houses. So now he is a person in whom I shall have confidence and who is experienced. He lives in Cambridge." 5 years earlier, in 1880, Frederick Leach, together with his elder sister Isabella, had opened his shop and showrooms at 3 St Mary's Passage. This is obviously a contemporary photograph. It's now the Sahara dress shop. And it's between King's Parade and the Market Square. Incidentally, Frederick opened this showroom just before Morris & Co. opened theirs on Oxford Street. So they're parallel, their companies. A piece in the Journal of Decorative Art declares, "Visitors to the old university town of Cambridge must have been struck with the quaint old world front, half timbered and stuccoed, which they see as they traverse the open space known as St Mary's Passage. This is the showrooms and offices of Messrs F.R. Leach and Sons, a name well known in art circles in Cambridge. Mr. Leach is a thorough craftsman and loves his art with an undivided affection. To enter into his place is to at once be conscious of the influence of a lover of fine things. By when we say fine things, we do not mean costly, but things which impart an air of refinement to wherever they may be found. There is a selective quality about all one sees in Messrs Leach's place, which stamps at once the character of those who are responsible for them." And here he is. the lover of fine things with a reputation for taste and refinement, gloriously dandified in this gently teasing cartoon sketch from the Leach archive by his eldest son, Barnet Maclean Leach. You see BML down the bottom there. Frilled cuffs, heels, and a pocket full of his trusty notebook, pen, and rule. Looking every inch the man who might swoop in and rescue Maud Darwin from her fraught decorating decisions. And I love the waggy dog tail on the side there. One of the things that's always mentioned in the diaries and notebooks are pets. Pets and the deaths of pets are a big feature. And here is an advertisement from Spalding's Almanac in 1882, so 2 years after the shop opened, which shows the extent of the range of fabrics and furnishings provided. So glass and pottery fired at the works, as it says at the top, paper hangings from the best English houses, and so on, including stained glass, of course. The firm was clearly supplying a demand for high-class, artistic, tasteful interiors in Cambridge, and there is no doubt that demand at this time was high. Florence Ada Keynes recalled the fever that was the aesthetic movement when it struck in Cambridge around 1880. A period of dreary dowdiness in clothing and in house decoration had persisted through the 70s, but towards the end of the decade, reaction came in a riot of colour. Burne-Jones drew willowy forms clad in rainbow hues. William Morris wove textiles rampant in design. Newnham caught the fever. We trailed about in clinging robes of peacock blue, terracotta red, sage green or orange, feeling very brave and thoroughly enjoying the sensation it caused. And with the abandonment of the rules which insisted that academics must resign their fellowships if they married, there was a flurry of marriages, house building, and the requirement for artistic interior design. As Florence Keynes again succinctly put it, thus Cambridge became a place where women could be educated and men could be married, and the results have not seldom been combined. Frederick Leach's pocket diaries for the 1880s read like a who's who of Cambridge town and gown, with lists of paper numbers, room measurements, and scribbled notes of the fitting out of entire houses. There is much fruitful further research to be done here. But this was also a busy and prestigious time for the firm outside Cambridge, with a great deal of work being done in very grand private houses, particularly in London for William Morris and Philip Webb, such as this one, Old Swan House in Chelsea, and including staterooms at St James's Palace. Leach and his firm were riding high, carrying out a great deal of artistic, secular and domestic work. Those of you who have already had a tour of David Parr House may recognise these patterns. In the 1880s, Frederick Leach is so frequently working for William Morris that he employs his own form of Morris shorthand. When estimating at Old Swan House in Chelsea, I don't know how easily you can read that, but he jots down ceiling as at Howard's, and Howard's is 1 Palace Green, Philip Webb House for George and Rosalind Howard. Cornice as at Palace, that's St James's Palace, and frieze to be cost as Rounton, that's Rounton, East Rounton Grange, Philip Webb House, decorated by Morris. Also at this time, the Leach firm set up briefly offices in London, I think probably to handle the importance of this sort of work. But what of the church decorating aspect of the business? How had that fared since the firm was first established in 1862? On Saturday, the 21st of May, 1881, the Wigton Advertiser reported on the successful completion of the restoration and redecoration of the local parish church, stating that the decorative work has been left in the hands of Mr. Leach of Cambridge, who stands high in his profession, having made the decoration of churches and public buildings his especial study. So, Wigton. Does anyone know where Wigton is? Cumbria. Yes, it is in Cumbria. No, it's just north of what we now know as the Lake District. What on earth was Frederick Leach doing in Cumbria? Hold that thought. We will be coming back to that later. For now, the point is the reference to Leach standing high in his profession, his reputation being in the decoration of churches and public buildings, and significantly that this expertise comes from study and knowledge, as well as skill and artistry. This is the very Ruskinian idea which nourished the arts and crafts movement of head, hand and heart working together for true workmanship. In church decoration, for the Leach firm, it's possible to track the progression from the 1860s to the 1880s, from working entirely for others, carrying out their designs, to becoming designers in their own right, and indeed supervising the work of others and becoming themselves the experts. This is a trade card, a list of buildings where examples of Leach work can be seen. I shall come back to this as a crucial source later, but for now, as I promised earlier, I'll show you just some examples of where you can go in Cambridge and still see the work of the Leach firm. So I'm just going to look at those three marked there: St Michael's Church, St Giles and St Clement's. So this is St Giles on the corner of Chesterton Lane and Castle Hill, opposite the Museum of Cambridge. And this is the chancel ceiling. Very Leach-like, or so I thought when I first saw it, and I spent several hours looking through vestry records and parish magazines at St Giles to find out whether it was by Leach. And all I could find at that point was a reference to Barnet Maclean Leach, Frederick's son, as the artist of the panels painted in copper on the rood screen. Nothing at all about the roof, except a cryptic reference to a gentleman of the town. However, further research discovered two Leach letters deposited at the William Morris Gallery, which solved the mystery. This letter is from Reverend Francis Slater, Vicar of St Giles, dated 10th of January 1876, and it thanks Frederick Leach for his most kind offer to decorate the roof. 2 months later, another letter reveals that the work was carried out by Frederick Leach, but without payment and on the understanding that he would not be publicly thanked or acknowledged for his work. Reverend Slater writes, "I will respect your desire not to be thanked for the work on the roof and will not bring forward in vestry any proposal for a vote of thanks, as I should have done." Not accepting payment for work done, especially in the chancel of a church, is a feature of Frederick's working life and may go a long way to account for his self-perceived lack of success in business. So this is the wonderful east wall painting in St Clement's Church, designed and painted by Frederick Leach. St Clement's is on Bridge Street at the top of Portugal Place. This is a painting of Christ surrounded by all the fathers and saints of the church, each with their traditional emblems. And it's thought that perhaps Frederick Leach painted himself in as 15th century fresco painter Fra Angelico, who's there. Recognisable by his palette and brush and by his nimbus, which is painted in individual rays of light rather than a full halo, because he had not at that point been beatified. So he's sort of halfway there. You won't be surprised to hear, looking at this, that the then vicar of St Clement's was an Anglo-Catholic. I was amused to discover when researching this work that Reverend Ward was apparently a very stout man of very high church persuasion, and so was known as the Real Presence. And his curate, Canon Wood, also a Tractarian, was a very thin man and therefore known as the Wafer. And this postcard image of St Clement's, I'm sorry, these are quite hard to see, but the point is the extent of the painting that you can see that is no longer there, sadly. It seems highly likely that this was also carried out by the Leach firm, but I'm still working on this one. Very hard to track down the right documentation for the church work. So this is part of the stunning St Michael's reredos. So St Michael's is now Michael House on Trinity Street. So the reredos was created for the remodelling of the church in honour of the vicar William Bement, founder of the Cambridge School of Art, now Anglia Ruskin University, of course, who had died suddenly in office in 1868. Work on the reredos was carried out by the Leach firm in 1874, but it was designed by George Gilbert Scott Jr. And it seems clear from this letter in the William Morris Gallery from Scott to Leach that Scott was closely supervising the painting. Among other things, Scott writes, "You might get on with the angels in the cusped heads above the Last Supper." Those along the top there. "They may be just like those on the screen, which you already have a copy of." So they're clearly working, as he worked with Morris, he's working with Scott very closely. And this postcard image, again, shows the original extent of the painted work. So here we're in the cafe. Those of you who know who know Michael House, it's the cafe, and that's now screened off with glass doors. And I think it's in the ladies' loos where you can still see a shadow of some of this work on a column.
Sorry, excuse me. Shelley, you can see some of the vertical
yes, on the
illustrations.
Particularly on the edge. It's right just black, isn't it? It's just like a black outline now, is that right?
No,
it's more
visible.
Ah, okay.
So those who can't access the ladies' loop.
Yes, they can see something else. Thanks, Judith. So this shows the extent of the painted wall decoration, and once again the parish records reveal Leach's generosity. The principal gift is that of Mr. Leach, who has done the whole work of the decoration of the roof and of the walls of the chancel without charge. Yep. So as the quote from the Wigton newspaper showed earlier, Mr. Leach of Cambridge's reputation for church decoration was high by the 1880s. In his own entry for the census of 1881, Frederick Leach gave as his occupation designer and art worker, whereas 10 years before it had been simply painter, church ornament. By the late 1880s, a stained glass window was referred to as being from the studio of F.R. Leach. So by the 1880s, the Leach firm and Frederick Leach in particular had developed a high reputation in public and domestic buildings and in church decoration locally and nationally. Now, success in Frederick Leach's chosen business was partly a matter of what he knew, and there is no doubt that he was a skilled and knowledgeable artist and craftsman, a true art worker, and someone who took on and trained apprentices to give them the same skills. And these were specifically the non-mechanized skills and techniques of the medieval craftsmen who had built the cathedrals and churches before the Reformation, which they were modelling the work on. And here, very briefly, are some of those skilled art workers, most of whose names, as you can see, we now know. And again, there could be a whole other talk devoted to them. There's been a lot of research done. But I wanted to show you their faces at least, as it is their hands who held the tools that carried out all this beautiful work. And finding out more about them is a lot of what motivates me to carry on with the research. But success, as I say, was not only about what Leach knew, his skills and expertise, it was also a matter of who he knew, or rather of who got to know his work and trust his skills and abilities, and those of the people he trained to send out to do the work. And this is where several networks, routes, and connections become important. And these are the many pieces and layers I'm still putting together. Key clients and commissioners were architects and churchmen, as well as wealthy individuals with artistic proclivities who employed the services of well-known architect designers to provide them with homes of taste. So through from the mid-1860s to the 1880s, Frederick Leach had worked with some of the most renowned architects and designers of the Gothic revival. With Philip Webb and William Morris, mostly but not exclusively on secular buildings, and with George Frederick Bodley, Charles E Kempe and George Gilbert Scott Jr. on schemes of church decoration all over the country. The huge increase in the building of new churches and the drive to remodel and beautify existing medieval churches, spurred on by the Tractarian high church ideals of the Oxford movement and the Ecclesiological Society provided a constant demand for highly skilled craftsmen and artists to carry out the design schemes in appropriately artistic ways. So now I'm just going to give you another look to show that development of the art workmanship, and again give you some examples to see in Cambridge. So here at Jesus College, Cambridge, in the chapel, Leach is working for Bodley, but being supervised closely by Morris. This is part of the chapel ceiling. The angels round the edge were designed by Morris and painted by his chief painter, George Campfield, but the panel effect middle section was painted by Leach. Letters between Bodley and fellows of the college at the time reveal the relationships and indicate how relatively low Frederick Leach's standing was at this time, early in the life of the firm. This is still the 1860s. Some astonishment is felt at the employment of a Cambridge workman in the execution of a work which was entrusted to Mr. Morris, states the Dean. And Bodley's response is, Morris finds Leach a very capable and able executant. The design and the exact shades of the colours are all done according to the directions given to him. He is doing it quite as well as Morris's men would. And just 2 years later, here at All Saints Church in Jesus Lane, Cambridge, the Cambridge Chronicle reports on the completion of the first stage of decorative painting, saying, "Great praise must be given to Mr. F.R. Leach, our fellow townsman, who is carrying out these works. For it is no small credit these days to be able to work out such details in freehand drawing and without the usual mechanical methods, which are too often made to do duty in ornamentation, but which in truth lead the workman further and further off from a true living art. And we rejoice that so important a step in the education of the art workman should be so successfully illustrated in Cambridge. The whole scheme of decoration and designs are under the superintendence of Mr. C. E. Kempe, M.A. of London, who has also given his personal attention to their accomplishment." So here at All Saints, Bodley was once again the architect-designer, but with Charles Kempe supervising the now art workman, Frederick Leach, whose specialist skills are being praised. The report goes on to say that the whole of the nave roof has been decorated by Mr. Leach, guess what? At his own cost. I urge you to go and see All Saints Church in Jesus Lane. The church will be open this coming weekend as part of Open Cambridge from 10 till 4, and you'll have the added bonus of the Divine Designs exhibition, which is a glorious celebration of 150 years of the firm of Watts & Co., which was set up by Bodley, Garner and Gilbert Scott Jr. So that will be a real treat to see. Now this one's harder for you to go and visit. These 3 images are all of St John's to Brook in Liverpool. Again, a Bodley church, which Leach painted, and this time we have evidence from that one and only surviving account book that's at the Museum of Cambridge, that it was Kempe who paid Leach for his work there, not Bodley. Working together on churches around the country eventually caused friction between Leach and Kempe, until finally in 1874 Leach relinquished business with Kempe, as he said, owing to the hands not recognising one as sole employer. And this is very difficult, these complex relationships working on one job, that people, it would be very difficult to get the work done to time and so on when there were too many people who they were beholden to. One of Frederick Leach's apprentices and former glass foreman, Alfred Tombleson, whose initials we saw earlier, went to work solely for Kempe and then went on to run the studio for many years. And as another example of how significant the personal connections are, from 1880, Bodley stopped employing the Leach firm to carry out his decorative schemes, using instead the firm of Powell Brothers of Lincoln. Incidentally, the Powell brothers had previously worked for and most likely been trained by Leach. But with one exception, from 1880, Leach did not work on another Bodley church. So these personal links and who people chose to use became important. At the end of June 1879, Frederick had jotted in his diary, "The difficulties in paying one's way made me sensible of either inability in the management of business affairs or else idleness in oneself. I often wish one had taken to some employment in which there had only been self to do with. So evidence there that Frederick Leach himself didn't always see these personal work connections as a benefit to his business. They were tricky things to manage. So, in what at first might appear to be a bit of a rogue move, I'm going to take us off to Cumbria now, remembering that in 1881, the local newspaper in Wigton in Cumbria was praising the skills and expertise of Frederick Leach following the restoration and redecoration of the local parish church. So what was Leach doing up there? Well, quite a lot, it turns out. The red triangles mark churches and the blue circles are houses. None of this work was carried out for Morris, Bodley, Kempe, Webb or Scott, although there is a link to Gilbert Scott Jr. In that the architect with whom Leach worked on most of these buildings had been articled in Scott's office, so there's a succession there. This architect was Charles James Ferguson, county architect for Cumberland, whose private house, Cardew Lodge, the blue dot near Carlisle, represents. And just to remind ourselves now of the sort of work that Leach is doing in these places, the top of the list there, St James's, Carlisle. This is a postcard image cropped of the apse at St James's. Ignore the colour scheme. It's rather bizarre, sort of lilac. It's because it's one of those early colourised postcards of a black and white image, so it's not that colour scheme, but you can see the extent of the decorative scheme. And this is, the next one is All Saints at Wroughton Head. Different style, I don't know how well you can see that, but all, sort of wrapping all around the chancel there is damask style, fictive textile wall painting, which is a slightly different style. You haven't got the bands, the broken up bands of the wall, it's slightly different. And this is all areas of research that I don't know with Wroughton Head, who he was working for, and the extent to which that may be Leach's own, entirely own designs. But it's these buildings that I think give us more of a clue as to why and how the Leach firm came to be employed so extensively in Cumbria. So what I've pointed out there is Rose Castle, the seat of the bishops of Carlisle from 1230 to 2009, and therefore the home from 1869 of this man. Does anyone know who this is? This is Harvey Goodwin. Now, Harvey Goodwin became Bishop of Carlisle in 1869, but before that he was very much a Cambridge man. He graduated from Caius College, he became vicar at St Giles, on the churches I showed you earlier, and then at St Edward's in Cambridge, and then Dean of Ely Cathedral. As a student, he was an active member of the Cambridge Camden Society, whose publications went on to have such a strong influence on the design of English churches. And in Chesterton, he set up the Cambridge Industrial School for Boys, aiming expressly not only to instruct the hands of the boys, but also their heads and hearts. And this is my cue to encourage you, and endorsing what Mary said in her introduction. If you don't know the Capture in Cambridge website, please go and have a look at it. If you do know it, go back again, as I say, because there is so much more on there. It's a splendid resource. It's a wonderful interactive local history map of Cambridge, and it had its genesis here, the Mill Road History, and went on to be hosted and nurtured by the Museum of Cambridge. So please do have a look. Anyway, back to the story, the connections and Cumbria. When Harvey Goodwin died in 1891, he was buried at St Kentigern's Church in Crosthwaite in Cumbria, where this man was vicar. Does anyone know who that is? Yes, that is Hardwick Drummond Rawnsley.
I was at Crosthwaite Church 10 days ago.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, you're going to see it again in a minute. So yes, Hardwicke Rawnsley was one of the founders of the National Trust, together with Robert Hunter and, of course, Octavia Hill, and an avid protector and campaigner for the beautiful natural landscape of what we now know as the Lake District. He was a close friend of Beatrix Potter, and he also wrote a memoir of his good friend Harvey Goodwin. Significantly, Hardwicke Rawnsley had been one of the Hinksey diggers, the group of Oxford undergraduates, including Oscar Wilde, who, under the direction of John Ruskin, had undertaken manual road building work. Rawnsley later referred to this episode as a consciousness awakening and life-changing experience. Rawnsley and his wife Edith founded the Keswick School of Industrial Art in 1884, with classes in wood carving and repoussé metalwork, taught in the first instance by tutors brought up specially from South Kensington. This is the school, and although you can't see it very clearly on this photo, below the balcony on the facade there is painted, "The loving eye and patient hand shall work with joy and bless the land." And this is a gorgeous example of the work of the school, the Rawnsley Shield, an award for bell ringing, as you can see, designed by Edith Rawnsley herself, but made by the boys at the school. There is St Kentigern's at Crosswaite. On offering the incumbency of St Kentigern's Crosswaite to Hardwicke Rawnsley in 1883, Harvey Goodwin wrote, "In my opinion, the post which I offer you is as near as heaven as anything in the world can be." 6 years later, 1889, this is an entry in Frederick Leach's diary for 1889. It includes, as his entries often do when he's estimating for jobs, sketches of the inside of the church. There's actually 3 more pages of sketches before this one. And as you might be able to see here, he gives details of his journey to Penrith and on to Keswick. He splashes out 9pence on refreshments and papers, stays at the Shoulder of Mutton Hotel, and on the 4th of April 1889 meets Reverend Rawnsley at Crosswaite Church. Now, the influence of this man, John Ruskin, is unsurprisingly everywhere in these Lakeland collaborations. Ruskin had made his home at Brantwood in Coniston since 1873 and was very involved in setting up small-scale cottage industries in the most rural areas of Cumbria. Frederick Leach was certainly familiar with the work and ideas of John Ruskin. Ruskin had given the inaugural address at the Cambridge School of Art back in 1858, and in 1861 had gifted 25 Turner watercolours to the Fitzwilliam Museum. Frederick Leach went to see the Turner Drawings exhibition organised by Ruskin at the Fine Arts Society in July 1878, and in the following year he purchased the Stones of Venice and Modern Painters. On the 22nd of February 1888, he attended one of Charles Waldstein's free lectures on Ruskin at the Museum of Archaeology here in Cambridge, and on the 5th of December 1901, he travelled to Sheffield to a Guild of St George meeting at the Ruskin Museum. Now, there is no evidence yet that Frederick Leach ever visited Ruskin, but it is remarkable that the only deaths outside friends and family that Frederick recorded in his diaries are those of the Queen and John Ruskin. So you can see here, 1900, 20th of January, John Ruskin died, 25th, John Ruskin buried in Coniston churchyard. And less than a fortnight later, Frederick was staying in a hotel in Grasmere, just 12 miles from Coniston. And there's no evidence of any work around that. So my strong feeling is that he travelled up specifically to pay his respects, but that is guesswork. So as I said at the start of this evening, I'm sharing work in progress here. Many of these links will come to light. But it seems to me that Leach in Cumbria is an interesting case study in the connections between Tractarian high church Gothic revival design and redecoration of churches, and the true arts and crafts ideology and values of respect for nature, opposition to over-industrialisation and mechanised work, and the joy in skilled crafts where head, hand and heart combine. Cumbria was by no means the only region of the country in which the Leach firm worked, and there are many more of these connections still to be worked out. And let's just quickly look back again at this key source in the Leach family archive. This is a double-sided card, so I've just put two sides on one slide here. And it says, this is where examples of our work can be seen. And if I show you the list again, there we are. I showed you some of the Cambridge churches earlier. But when I first came across this document in the Leach archive, it surprised me that some really significant work, some of which we've seen, known to be by the firm and still extant in Cambridge, was not here. Where was Jesus College Chapel, All Saints Church, Queen's Old Hall, and so on? My hunch was that the trade card very specifically meant what it said, where examples of our work can be seen, meaning work not only carried out by the firm, but to their own designs. So we can see, so for example, the St Michael's Church I showed you earlier, the reredos was very clearly being commissioned and he was working with Scott, but then discovered, and so I thought, why, that disproved my theory for a while that this St Michael's was clearly somewhere he was working for someone else. But of course, then the parish records revealed that Leach had painted the walls and so on of the chancel free of charge. So there's a lot in Cambridge, which obviously I haven't had time to do. This is the sort of Cumberland collection here, including Wigton. And then there's another little collection in Liverpool, but not including St John's to Brook, because of course he did that for Bodley with Kempe. And then we have here St Paul's Church, Newport, Isle of Wight, and Brough Church as well, down there. So, hang on. So let's just look briefly at how Leach was logistically able to work all across the country, like this. Here is a map showing the extent of the rail network in 1837, the year that Frederick Leach was born. These tiny little red worms are the railways. And this is the rail network in the year the railway arrived in Cambridge, 1845. When young Frederick recalled travelling to London by train for the first time. And obviously you can see the line from London up through Cambridge, Norwich to the coast. And this is the railway coverage by 1881, when Leach's business was arguably at its peak. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Frederick Leach travelled by train first to meet his client and to estimate for a job. He then sent workers with the relevant skills and training to do the job. He arranged for tools and additional materials to be sent to jobs as needed by train, and he travelled again several times himself to carry out work or to supervise the work of his waged workers. This business model, as we would now call it, just would not have been possible without the extensive railway routes. I should say, if you go to the Campop, the pop group website, there is a fantastic animation of this, which shows you the growth of development of the railways and then the horrific disappearance of them after beaching. It's a very graphic and well worth a watch. And this really is any excuse to show a wonderful William Frith painting. This one is Paddington Station in London in 1862, the year Frederick Leach started his business at City Road. You can see the luggage being piled on top of the carriages there, just to be covered by a tarpaulin. And as ever with Frith, loads of dramas going on in the foreground. And although the railway network grew apace, the trains themselves weren't going faster than 30 miles an hour. So it was, it was not as speedy as one might imagine. Train travel was cold, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. Separate carriages, poorly lit, led to a reputation for theft, and crashes were quite common. So it's perhaps surprising that Frederick Leach rarely comments directly on his experience of travelling. He notes all the times and the fares and so on. And on the whole, this is always a dangerous thing to say, isn't it? On the whole, he doesn't talk about problems. Now, that could mean because problems were so frequent they weren't worth recording, or that they genuinely didn't happen. But though he did suffer the occasional mishap, such as when he had to walk an extra mile across fields, he was very put out, due to having been put off the train as a bridge had been washed away in a storm. So things did go amiss. The distances travelled and the locations reached by train recorded in Frederick's diaries are impressive. To give just one by no means exceptional example, this is on the 27th of October 1880. Frederick Leach travelled from Cambridge to meet Bodley and the Reverend Burnside in Plumtree, Nottinghamshire at St Mary's Church. He then journeyed on to Bradford, where he stayed overnight with his brother-in-law, George Goodenough, a tailor. The following day, he travelled to Carlisle and then on to Silloth, where he met up with his son Barnet and another Leach art worker, Charles Gray. They all travelled back to Carlisle, on to Rose Castle, then Wroughton Head Church, then back to Carlisle to take an estimate to Charles Ferguson, and finally they caught the midnight train from Carlisle and arrived back in Cambridge at 10:15 the next morning. And it's by no means exceptional. This is the sort of thing they were doing all the time. So ability to travel and communicate efficiently over long distances enabled business opportunities to be realised. But there were also social and personal opportunities as well. David Parr and his wife Mary are one example of this, which I will leave you to hear at the David Parr House. But I've got another example here from the Leach firm. This is St Salvador's Church in Dundee in Scotland, one of Leach's furthest flung jobs. It was designed by George Frederick Bodley and was consecrated in 1874. Frederick travelled to Dundee in the autumn of 1878 with his three sons, Mac, Barnet, Rick, Frederick, and Wally, Walter, to carry out the painting of the walls. Frederick recorded this journey in unaccustomed detail in his diary. 14th of September, Mac, Rick, Wally, and myself start 8:50 GER to catch 12 boat for Dundee. The day very calm indeed. 15th, the weather rough. Rick turns up sick. He and Wally too remain so all day. Wet coming on obliges to be in cabin. The smells, etc. make me sick too, but without retching. We arrive in port at 8 o'clock, but have to remain on board till 1 in the morning. Halls and a friend meet us and give us a most hearty reception at Mrs. Byers, 9 Ellen Street, where we stay. Just 1 year later, another journey was being made to Dundee for the wedding of Henry Halls, the Leach art worker, and Bella Byers, daughter of their landlady of the previous year. The wedding took place in St Salvador's, and this time Frederick's wife, Mary Ann, and eldest daughter, Ada, also took the boat trip and returned to London with the newlyweds on the steamer Britannia. There it is. Henry and Bella Halls settled back in Cambridge, where they raised their 5 children. And again, whole other story there. So I'm just going to end this evening with a quote from the Historic England listing document for St Mary's Passage from 2020, because this sums up why I continue to be motivated to research into the work of the Leach firm, however frustrating it can be at times. St Mary's Passage is associated with F.R. Leach and Sons, the firm of highly talented painters and craftsmen who carried out schemes that adorned many prestigious buildings in Cambridge and throughout the country. The work of these largely overlooked artisans has been overshadowed by the renown of figures such as Morris and Bodley, whose designs they brought to life. So the survival and protection of F.R. Leach's showroom is an important step in recognising their achievement. So that's it. Thank you all for coming along, and this is how you can contact me.
Yeah, we're all glad you braved the weather for that. Well worth it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
That's an awful lot of work you've done there, and it looks like you're
Still doing, yes. Well, doing it again, which is lovely, back in the archives. Yeah.
absolutely wonderful. A few questions.
Did he send his team of workmen all over the country for extended periods of time, because it must take quite a long time to do these sketches. I think it's really nice, the story you said about him going up to the wedding of one of his artwork, because it shows that it demonstrates a really sort of family type relationship, which is lovely to hear.
And that comes through in all sorts of different ways. But yes, he did. And the timing of these, particularly the large churches, so there's a lot of coordination that goes on, hence people falling out with each other all the time. So scaffolding is an enormous bone of contention, because the builders pay for and put the scaffolding up, but then they need to leave it there for the painters to come in and use. And so often Leach's workers turn up and the scaffolding's been taken away because actually it was only paid for until the builders finished and so on. So there's a lot of coordination. And yes, he sends teams of people up, but also individuals or pairs of people or someone, one worker with an apprentice, to go up for a specific amount of time. They then leave and go on to another job while something else is happening at that church. And then perhaps another or even the same worker will go back to do their specialised bit of painting on a different part of the building. So they are all travelling around. And it's very interesting. For the David Parr House, for instance, the extent to which we thought, well, you know, how is he travelling around and doing all this painting and so on? But when you look at the dates, the time he's able to spend painting his house at home is when he's finished largely doing all this travelling around. They were travelling a lot.
The logistics.
Yes, extraordinary.
Did he also have a team, kind of an admin team?
He had a manager. The Leach firm had a manager, and in fact, he was on that during the 1880s period. It was Charles Ogle, he was called, who was sort of managing the post, if you like. But it was actually Leach himself who worked out and did the travelling and allocated people to jobs. So it's an extraordinary logistical.
He must have been a remarkable, absolutely remarkable man, because not only did he have all this artistic ability, but the organisation and the training of the people who work.
Yes, no, it is extraordinary. And if you think that I think in 1871 in the census, the firm is 12 workers and 2 boys is the total. In 1881, it's 28 workers and 6 boys. You know, it's over doubled in 10 years. It's a big enterprise, that he's managing. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on the paints he used?
I can, to the extent that they were not the pre-made oil paints that were available. So he was mixed, not him personally, obviously when he was doing the work he was, but his part of the training, for example, of someone like David Parr was to learn to prepare the paints. And a lot of that, the early diary I talked about, Frederick Leach's diary from his teens, when he is working for his older brother, whole paragraphs of each week in that diary are about mixing colours and learning to mix colours and cleaning everything properly and learning to varnish and so on. So they mix their own colours. And one of the things, I think it came out in a couple of the quotes where someone says, you know, Morris says he's doing everything according to the colours that I say and so on. The architect, when he's working for architect designers, they are meticulous about making sure they've mixed exactly the right shade of colours. And there's an example in the David Parr House where one of those mixings goes wrong and the colour that's supposed to be green goes black. So we know they are mixing their own paints. What I am not yet clear about, and it's obviously a live issue, is this whole issue of fresco or mural painting in church, particularly in churches. You know, famously the Oxford, it wasn't a church, but the Oxford, the murals in the Oxford Union, you know, they deteriorated very rapidly because the surface wasn't prepared. It wasn't about the paints, it was about the surface particularly. Leach incidentally went back and repainted that, and the design you see now is Leach work. But there's an example that's relevant to what I've been talking about tonight with Charles Ferguson, the architect in Cumbria. He was also a partner in a firm called Robinson's Cement in the late 19th century up in Cumbria. And there's a newspaper account that I've read of one of their meetings where Charles Ferguson stands up and talks about the fact that this cement is all very good and he's very pleased at how well the business is going. But when it comes to churches, his work, I can't remember what he calls him, it's like a colleague, but obviously it's not that word, Mr. Frederick Leach of Cambridge has assured him that the surface that they're looking for is the texture of serge cloth. And obviously this is to give enough of a grip. It's got to be smooth, but it has to have enough of a grip for this paint. And actually, it's a bit of a pet theory at the moment, but it's based on things like what's going on in the David Parr house. I think an awful lot of this was distemper. Yeah, yeah.
4 coats of white paint. Preparation.
Yes.
Yes.
Can 2 things. One is an observation, drawing things. Looking at handwriting and the literacy of the lady of the pickle who was also a cook, it reminds me that basically we tend to think that people were a lot less well educated than in many ways they were. I mean, I think as if you were a cook in a large house, you had to be literate. But it's just the sophistication of the way she writes and everything else. Her handwriting is a lot better than mine.
Yes.
The other thing is, well, there are 2 things really. One, I worked on the conservation of, managing a course on the conservation of architecture for the Leopard Chapel.
Oh, yes.
The Leopard Chapel, I don't know whether you know, was originally, in 1816, 1817, it was set to be sold as a job lot, and the wood and everything else disassembled. It didn't happen for various reasons. But Gilbert Scott was much involved with trying to get it back on its feet. Do you know if he had any involvement with the Leopard Chapel?
I don't. It hasn't come up. Do you mean that whether Leach did?
Yeah.
Yes. No. Nothing has come up in the diaries. But did you say 1816?
Yeah.
Yes, that would be
That
his
was it.
father.
But no, the son was involved with the rest. Well, basically, if you look at early prints of the Leopard Chapel, it was one stage, it was a dwelling house. It had an upstairs,
Right.
a fire coming up one end. But his son was involved in getting it back together. If you didn't know.
Okay. No,
So
I
that's
didn't.
junior.
Right.
So I wondered just in case he
Yes.
might have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously he works. Leach and George Gilbert Scott Jr. did work together a lot.
Yeah.
But the Leopard Chapel hasn't come up. Would it have what name would the building have gone under at that point? Do you know?
It was listed as a dwelling house at one stage.
Yes, so that's something
I'm not sure it was even strictly church property.
No, so actually I'd have to go back and
I think the
and look.
records are actually of Magdalen.
Oh, okay.
Because Magdalen College, for some reason, historically, was looking after the Leopard Chapel
Right.
for a while. And in that Gilbert Scott period when it got renovated, because they had punch all at one end that was crumbling.
Right.
So they kind of flintified it and
Yeah.
restored it there at one end. So that's where I'd go and have a look.
Yes, okay, well, I would need to look because, as you said, I've looked at it as a church building.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't, then it wouldn't necessarily have registered.
Sorry, I don't know, Lily, I think at one stage it was sublet, so.
Yeah.
The,
No, I will.
the only other thing I would say, you were talking about the records of, well, jobbing painters, essentially, and the whole architecture. And part of the problem that he was having was the fact that he didn't have an MA or anything like that. He wasn't qualified intellectually, quote unquote. But thinking about until, well, Charles Paris, if anybody knows that series, until the 1970s, 1980s, a lot of the repertory actors spent most of their time travelling around the country by train and staying in boarding houses.
Yes.
I wouldn't imagine it was dissimilar to.
No, with an itinerant lifestyle in lodging houses, and yeah, absolutely. That's how they operate, as you say, a bit like being in yeah. Yes.
It seems unusual to us now that he did a fair amount of free work.
Yes.
Was that a bit more usual in churches in those days? Was it to do with his religious beliefs?
I think it was very much to do with his religious beliefs. I don't know how unusual it was for other painters, for example. I haven't done enough kind of comparative work across people. I'm looking at the moment into the Powell brothers, who I mentioned, who Bodley carries on with. So it would be interesting to see if I can find out whether they also did the same thing. But the only other example I know is that Minton of Minton Tiles, the encaustic tiles that church floors are often decorated with, he didn't charge for the tiles that were in the chancel often. So he would charge for it up to the rood, if you like, or to the screen, and then he wouldn't charge for in the holiest of holies. So I think, yeah, it is to do with, and I definitely speak about this more in the book, that there's a squeamishness about profiting from work done right up to the altar in a church. But no, Leach does seem to have taken it to quite an extreme, I have to say, and I don't know how common that is.
Rather small. Maybe. Thank you.